Uh, This is Jen Charette from the Wisconsin Towns Association. You know me, I'm Mark Hazelbaker with the Wisconsin Association of Campground Owners and Cachetta Legal Group in Madison. And we're here today to talk to you about some issues involving effectively working with town governments and zoning and land use issues, which are, of course, are issues that everybody has to deal with. Jen, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Jan Charette, I'm one of the attorneys with the Wisconsin Towns Association. Our association is a statewide association. We serve, there are about 1,248 towns and 1,245 are members. And so we serve the 1,245 town members along with about 25 villages. So our organization goes out, we provide legal information to our members, we provide educational opportunities, and then we also lobby on their behalf. So they invited me here today to be able to provide information on how to work with your towns. So I'm looking forward to that after Mark's done.
I want to start out by saying that obviously I would venture that 95% of the, are you getting my audio okay?
Barely.
I'm talking to the videographer. Are you getting my audio? All right, I'll try to talk a little louder then. We do have some competition there, I hear. I'm going to bet that 98%, more than 95, 98% of our campgrounds are in towns. The ones that are in cities and villages that I've talked to are miserable because it's not a land use that fits very well with a city and village's vision of how to use property. So learning what towns are all about, learning how towns work is really important. I also do a lot of work with towns. I was the attorney for the Dane County Towns Association, which is a unit, a county unit of the Wisconsin Towns Association for 26 years. I retired from that after we got some legislation passed in 2016 that gave the towns in Dane County the chance to leave county zoning, which is something that they had wanted to do forever. We'll talk about that as we go into the details of this. It's really important that we are trying to build a strong relationship with the Wisconsin Towns Association. And I'm going to start out by saying that everybody has mixed feelings about their own town, but I do want to say a few good things about towns because there are actually a lot of good things to say about towns. First of all, towns are by far the most approachable unit of government that exists, period. End of statement. Most of your towns are going to have perhaps 1,500, perhaps 2,500 people, often less. The biggest town in Wisconsin has something like 20,000 people, I think, Grand Chute, but that's an exception. Most towns are small and rural. Towns are very easy to approach. You've got 3 supervisors. I have yet to hear of somebody spending even $5,000 getting elected to a town board. I'm sure it's happened, but by and large, the elections are based on people running who are known in the community and get out there and let people know that they're interested. Actually, in a lot of towns, the elections take the form of, you got to run. I don't want to run. Yeah, you got to run. Seriously, it's got to find somebody who's willing to make the sacrifice. That's even more so true of the clerk. And Jen was a clerk for a few years. Town clerks have enormous responsibilities. Just the running elections, even in a small town, 500 people, running elections could easily take a third of a full-time position because keeping voter lists managed, getting ready for the election, setting up the voting machines, it's just unbelievable how complicated it is. And on top of all that, towns have to handle all of the local services. So what else do towns do? Well, the thing about town government that I admire the most is that towns basically are volunteer government. That is, you know, if there's a problem with a pothole or a problem with a ditch, okay, if you're in a city or village, the typical response is, let's call the public works director, who in turn will then say, I got to call our consulting engineer, and $2,500 later, you have a cell phone picture of a pothole and a diagnosis, right? If there's a pothole problem in a town, somebody calls the town chairperson who goes out and looks at it, or calls the town patrol guy, the road guy, who goes out and looks at it, and she or he says, yeah, I put cold mix down, it's patched. So it's kind of simple. The other side of towns is that, of course, because they're so small, it's easy for a few people who are rabid or intense to push things, and that happens from time to time. So a lot of what we're going to talk to you about is it's just basic civics that you need because you have a lot at stake in what towns do to understand how they operate, to understand what the rules are, to understand what your goals are, so that you're fully and actively engaged, okay? We've had issues come up many, many times for Waco where an ordinance will be introduced or something will be proposed. And we hear from our local campgrounds. One of the first questions I will typically ask is, well, what do you know about your town board members? In a surprising number of instances, the answer is, I don't know, I've never met them, or I don't know, I've never talked to them, okay? We had a situation come up about 1.5 years ago where a town proposed to adopt a town licensing ordinance, and they were going to charge each of the campgrounds in the town an annual license fee of $15,000, right? And we got on that, but we discovered, and the campgrounds called us, and we discovered a couple things right away. One of which was most of the campgrounds that were calling us for help weren't members of Waco. So we made that point right away that, hey, if you want help, you got to join us. The second point we made was, or in asking the question, what do you know about the town board? Well, not much. See, the time to be engaged with your town is long before you ever need it. Okay, that's if I leave you with any one point today, it is that your town is your partner, they are your government, they are a service agency that takes care of you. And if you have the idea, well, I'm not going to bother calling them because they won't listen, you're absolutely wrong. I guarantee you that nothing influences elected officials more than engagement from constituents, provided it's the right engagement. You know, if you call them once a week to say, you stupid SOB, that pothole is still there on Ring Road. When the hell are you going to fix it, you idiot? Well, what do you feel like when a camper says that to you? Of course you don't like it. And are you more inclined to respond to them? Of course not. On the other hand, hey, I'm concerned because there's a really bad pothole on Ring Road and my campers are about to start moving in. Is there a chance we could get a town truck over there to get some cold mix in place to get that fixed? And is there anything I can do to help? You know, that kind of thing, okay? So that said, we're going to talk about zoning because that's the most important interface that you have with towns and counties. But we'll also talk about other issues. Carol will talk a little bit about the structure of towns, and hopefully we will leave you with a number of insights about effectively working with your towns. But I'll say it again because I say this every time I talk about the subject. You need to become active and engaged with your town, and for that matter, your county, because they have an awful lot to say. Go ahead.
I agree with that completely, Mark, and the best is if you can actually get on the board. That would be the best. Your town or county, that's not always possible, or it might not be work for some people, but all you have to do is show up at a meeting and just show up, and show up for every meeting or several meetings. And the chairman or what, you know, he or she might say, oh, is there something I can help with? No, I'm from the whatever campground, just saying hi and introducing myself or whatever, and just how are things going? You know, ask the board how things are going or whatever, you know, and just be there. Because it's a whole lot harder for them 6 months later when one of the supervisors or the chairman get a bug up and all of a sudden decide to do one of these crazy ordinances. Now they realize they're affecting that nice
Exactly.
gal that was just here last month. It's a huge difference.
And you know, you show up at a town board meeting and you hear something said like, well, we'd like to deal with this issue behind the town hall, but we don't have a skid steer. You raise your hand and say, I've got a skid steer. I'll send my man over and take care of it for you if you want. Maybe they will say, no, we can't do that because of liability, although there's an easy workaround on that. But you know, helping people, that's what it's all about. Towns, the fundamental point about a town is that to a degree that is unequaled with any other form of government. The town is the people. You have an annual meeting where the town electors get to vote directly on important issues like the levy and borrowing money and whether to buy or sell property. You have caucuses in many towns where people are nominated by who shows up instead of nomination papers. It's not politics as we have come to see it. That it's not toxic politics. It's more like playground politics, but those can be good if you know how to be good. So let's start talking about land use a little bit. Yeah, go ahead.
You don't necessarily want to be on the board because then you run into conflicts of interest.
If you're going to be doing anything, you don't. If you're thinking, I'm going to be doing an expansion in 2 years, no, you don't want to be on the town board. But on the other hand, if you're interested in getting your name out there and getting along, being on the plan commission for the town, which we'll talk about, might be a good thing. There's nothing wrong with serving, and certainly, you know, in counties that have a lot of campgrounds, it would be wonderful if one campground owner would be willing to bite the bullet and run for the county board, which is an undertaking. That's politics. That's where the minute you get beyond, the minute you get to the county level, especially these days, you're suddenly in the midst of a pretty intense struggle because these days every county has intense politics, whether we like it or not. All right, let's move on. Well, when we talk about land use, there are two terms in that word. Land use is the term we use to refer to, well, to put it in my terms, land use is what we talk about when we're discussing how somebody else should use their property, okay? And that when we talk about our own property, we just say, my property, right? But when you hear people talking about, I'm interested in land use, what they're saying is, I'm interested in telling somebody else how to use their property. And unfortunately, that's a very common thing, and it should be, because how we use property does affect other people. There are two terms in there that we have to understand. The one is the word land, and the other is the word use, okay? Well, what is land, okay? Really important issue. Will Rogers made a comment many years ago when he said, buy land, they're not making any more of it. And there are tiny exceptions to that. If you've seen the news, there are volcanic islands being created, but nobody's going to be doing subdivisions on them anytime soon, or they shouldn't be anyway. By and large, the land we have is the land we have. It's finite. In fact, we may be losing a few thousand acres a year if this sea level issue comes to bear. So land is a very finite resource. It is very important because it's the foundation of doing everything. Land, however, if you want to talk about land use, we're not talking about dirt, okay? That's an object. What makes land valuable is the right to control it, all right? Now, right now, we're in this room, all right? We have the right to have our little seminar here. And if people from the Association of Soil and Water Conservation Services came in here and said, you know, we want to start talking about erosion control, we'd say, no, we have this room, all right? Now, we don't own it. We don't have a lease on it. We have permission from the lawful owner of this property to have a seminar here, okay? And if you think about all of the things that go into what we're doing here, there is a title to the real estate which gives the hotel the ownership of this property, and therefore, if the soil and water people showed up and they wouldn't leave, they could call up the Stevens Point Police and say, we've got these disruptive soil conservationists that won't leave. Can you come over and help us? And they'd come over and they'd tell them to leave, because as the owners of this property, they have the right to control the use of the property. That's what property is. It is legally we call it the right to the exclusive enjoyment of a particular object or thing. That is to say, you can exclude others from how it is used and how it is enjoyed, okay? So it's a legal right. Real property, it comes from Old English law, and it says things that pertain to things in law. It also derives from royal titles. It's treated differently from personal property. Okay, there are formalities to it. As an example, if I wanted to sell this little bag, okay, if I wanted to sell this, I'll just sell it to you. Say, here, will you give me 50 cents for it? You'd say, I don't know. I say, well, it's a Turkish Airlines bag I got from when I flew to Istanbul. It's really cool. All right, I'll give you 50 cents just to shut you up. You give me 50 cents, I give it to you. The transaction's done. It is an enforceable transaction. I have sold all of my right, title, and interest in this. Real property is different. If I want to buy your campground and I say, I'll give you $1 million for your campground, well, what a deal, all right? And I give you a cashier's check for $1 million, you give me the keys and walk away, have I sold the campground? Have you sold the campground? No, you have sold what would be called an equitable title to the campground. But under the law of every state, including Wisconsin, in order to sell real estate, you have to convey it. And that's a legal term. And a conveyance means that it has to be in writing, it has to identify the property, it has to be delivered, it has to describe the consideration at least somewhere in the transaction. And if you want it to be enforceable against the world, it has to be recorded. You don't actually have to record deeds, but you're stupid if you don't, because then somebody can sell it to somebody else and you get into a tussle about who owned it. So there's a lot more formality. That's the long-winded way of saying real estate is different because it's not going anywhere. People fight over it, literally. So it's much more formal. Excuse me. As an illustration of these concepts, there are an awful lot of different elements to that right to exclude people, all right? Now, if you think of land as just dirt, you think, well, I've got this 1 acre piece of the surface, right? Well, it's so much more complicated than that. Our traditional legal doctrines, I guess there's no laser. Whoops. Our traditional legal doctrines say that if you own real estate, you own a slice of the earth from the core of the earth all the way up to infinity. As a practical, there's an old Latin maxim, cuius est soilum eius est usque ad infernum ad celum. Who owns the dirt owns from hell to heaven, literally. All right, so you have mineral rights, you own the groundwater, at least in Wisconsin. You own the right to use the groundwater. I should say you actually own the water under your property, although you can't pump more than a reasonable amount of it. You own the right to use the surface of your property for farming. You own the right to have trees, take the trees off. If a river or a lake exists on your property, you have certain rights of access to it, and you have rights over the air. You also have the right to change it by developing it, okay? When we talk about land use, one of the fundamental realities of land use regulation is that if you put a circle, a Venn diagram, a pie chart, I should say, showing the right to control property, even in the city of Madison, where land use is regulated as intensely as it is anywhere, the slice of rights that are controlled by the municipality would be no more than this. Owners control so much else. They control, because, all right, the city can say, well, we're going to zone this property to allow it to be used to build a 15-story building. That doesn't force the owner to build a 15-story building, okay? On Monroe Street in Madison, they rezoned a number of the houses in part of the Monroe Street nearer the Camp Randall Stadium to allow them to be turned into office buildings. They're all still houses. The owners don't want to tear their houses down. Owners control when to make changes, how to make changes, and what to do with them. The town may feel, and you'll hear this especially when you get into cities where they're talking plans, well, we'd really like to see this be something else. Down in my area, there's a tank farm of petroleum tanks in the village of McFarland on Terminal Drive. It's been there forever. If you drive into Madison, you can see it off to the left. The village would like it to go away. They think it looks bad. And it may not look that great. And the terminal owners have indicated, yeah, we're not going to move, because you're talking $250 million to relocate all those. It's a big terminal farm, and the village. So the village can say all they want. We think it's time for you to relocate, but they can't make them do that unless they condemn it, which is another story. So property rights are really important. You have the right to decide how you use your property. You have the right to initiate new changes in it. Our system is premised on the idea that individuals have the incentive to use their property in ways that make everybody better off. And we have the belief in our society that the sum of individual prosperity is societal prosperity. That is, if you make more money, there's more for everybody. And that tends to be true since you pay more taxes. Okay? How did this all happen? Well, if you go back about 220 years, there was a law passed called the Northwest Ordinance. That was in 1787. At that time, where we are sitting now was part of the state of Virginia. Because Virginia was originally granted a huge slice. When Queen Elizabeth granted the royal charter to the company that started Virginia, the charter said you go from this point on the Atlantic due west, period, no end, no bearing, and then you go on this point, and that point is down by Norfolk, okay? And this point on the Atlantic coast up in the Delmarva Peninsula, northwest, no ending point. So literally, Virginia had everything. And of course, they used to have West Virginia, but they kind of lost that in a family squabble. But so the Northwest Ordinance was the first big development deal that was cut after the founding of the United States. Virginia cut a deal with the rest of the states, and they said, all right, look, we'll relinquish our claim to all this territory, and we'll allow new states to be carved up, in exchange for which these things will exist. And some of the things that were put in the Northwest Ordinance were incredible for the time. There was to be free public education in all of those states. Slavery was banned, and they were to be surveyed, and the land was to be made available to be sold to individuals who could pay for it. I've studied the history of that extensively in the past few years because I've been writing a family history. Compared to what was going on in the world right now, that idea was so radical, I can't even begin. It makes Elizabeth Warren look like a timid person. It was so radical. The idea that ordinary people could own land, the idea that ordinary people could govern themselves and should be educated, it's unbelievably radical. So there was a bounty paid. If you would go out and survey this wild wilderness, why the government would pay you a certain amount of money for every section that you monumented and recorded. Surveyors got on pack horses. They took chains and compasses and astrolabes, and they surveyed Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan within 5 years. And that's with no electric power, no mosquito repellent, just on horseback with a pack roll. They created what's called the township system. And by the way, the 6 by 6 mile sections of land are called townships, but the governments are towns in Wisconsin. We don't use the term townships to describe governments. It's a misnomer. This is what the entire state of Wisconsin is laid out into. There's 1,263, I think it is, towns?
Right now they're 1,248.
Right, but there originally were 1,263. The whole state, the Illinois border is called the baseline, and then there's a line that's the eastern border of Grant County that goes straight north. That's the principal meridian. If you ever read a legal description, let's assume that this is the Illinois border and this is the eastern boundary of Grant County, right? This would be called Township 1 North. This is Township 2 North, Township 3 North, and this is Range 1. So this would be Range 1 East. This would be Range 1 West. And there are different range lines that as you go. So that tells you, when you look in those legal descriptions, it'll say a parcel of land lying in Township 5 North, Range 5 East. You can find exactly which township you're in with that number, okay? The nice thing about that grid, once it was laid out, it can be subdivided infinitely. All you need to do is find those monuments that the surveyors left, which is no small task, and you can infinitely subdivide it. And you keep going and going, down to the prosaic 40s, which are kind of like the basic unit of open land, but you can even take that smaller and smaller and smaller and generate rectangular lots. Once you get outside of rectangular lots, you can still do it, but it gets to be more complicated. So we use surveys that are described in a more complicated fashion. Like this is a lot over in the town of Little Wolf, and you gotta, this legal description, you'd say starting at the southwest corner, thence northeast by northwest, 200 feet at a bearing of south 45 degrees west. You've read them. You can also divide property by different, not just by area, but by time and different kinds of uses. So you can you can create what's called an easement. Let's say that this part of the room behind the table here belongs to Jen and me. This is our land, this is our property, right? And we can stand here and say, you can't get through here. This is ours, you're trespassing, right? Well, then somebody comes up to us from the soil and water conservationists and they say, well, tell you what, if you will let us into your little area, we will help you with the presentation. We have information that we can share. That sounds good, all right? You can do that. Oh, but if you don't give us permission to come into your property, well, we'll be trespassers. All right, well, come on in. No. That's just permission. We want an easement. We want to make sure that we can do this whenever we need to. So you record an easement that lets the soil and water conservationists come and go for the purpose of providing educational services from this podium. Got it? You can also say, well, I don't want to give you an easement. That's permanent. How about if I let you have a lease? I'll lease you the access rights you want for 6 months. That'll work. Or you could go one step lower and say, well, I'm not going to give you any possessory rights. I'm not going to let you have any quote-unquote title, any possession interests in this. I'll give you a license. That is, I'll give you permission or an invitation. So you can come here as long as you're talking, okay? And license is an important term for us because that's what your campers have. They don't have a lease, they don't have an easement, they don't have a servitude, to use a legal term. They have a license to come onto your property. There are also other ways that your property can be restricted. Utilities lay lines that are usually done by easements, but sometimes they're done by contract. There can be roadways that are laid out by the towns, which create rights of access and passage. And there are regulations and laws that restrict how you can use your property. And those concepts are all different and they're all complicated. So for example, you can build a roadway if you're doing a development. You can build a roadway and you can pay for it. And I paid $1 million a mile, which is what it costs to build this blacktop road. It's my road. And the town will say, or the city or village, that's true, it is. And if you want us to maintain it, and if you want to connect it to the existing road network, you have to dedicate it to the town. Oh, okay, well that's fine. I'll do that, I'll dedicate it, and then they take it over and everything's good. And then 2 years later, the town says, oh, we're gonna lower the speed limit on your road, our road. We're going to lower the speed limit to 35. Hey, wait a minute. I paid for that road. I want the speed limit to be 55, the way it was when I laid it out. Nope, it's going to be 35. That's our decision, and it is. So there's various, and by the way, another important distinction, you build a house and they change the zoning, you get to keep the house. It's a non-conforming use. If you were driving on your road at 55 miles an hour, okay, and you did that for 2 years, you got used to it, you can't say, Well, I've been driving on that road for 2 years at 55 miles an hour. I have a non-conforming right to keep driving at 55. No, police power changes don't have any such concept. So I've talked about easements. I've talked about, some other issues. How do these things, when you put restrictions on your property, how do they get noted? Through covenants, deed restrictions, plat notations. But you remember I talked earlier in my presentation that these are conveyances and there's formality involved in them. If you want to create anything that's of long-standing enforceability, it has to be in writing and it has to be part of the title to your property. So, for example, let's say that you decide you want to generate some cash. You've got some vacant land on your campground, so you decide, I'm going to create some residential lots on the edge of my campground and sell 1 acre lots, 5 1 acre lots, all right? Well, if you sell 5 1 acre lots to people on your campground, off of your campground, once you've sold those, all of those rights to exclude others and to have the incentive to use the property and to do things, those belong to the campers. To the owners. And guess what? What if they decide to put up a sign, which we'll assume for the sake of the hypothetical is legal under whatever sign ordinance exists, facing your campground that says, "To hell with Evergreen Campground, it's a sty," or something like that. Hey, you sold them the property, what do you expect, right? Or they decide, hey, what a great idea. I own this lot. I'm going to go to the town board. I'm going to get my parcel rezoned, and I'm going to open a tavern. And I'm going to start selling booze to these campers. And they do, and the town rezones it. And suddenly you've got all your campers trickling into this lot, getting drunk and stupid, and they've got loud music playing. And there's not a thing you can do about it. If you ever were to lot off land from your campground, you would want to impose deed restrictions. That would say, for example, that you can't have a business on this residential lot. It's to be used for residential purposes only. That there will be no commercial activity. There will be no signs facing the campground. There will be no harassment of campers. You may want to require that there be a fence between the property so that campers don't trespass onto theirs and vice versa. So you can do that. You can put restrictions on land, and indeed you definitely should. Many people that I've talked to over the years handling real estate transactions have said to me, buy land, never sell it. And that's not necessarily a bad rule, because land, once you sell land, it's gone, and you probably will realize later, I should have kept that. But certainly if you're going to sell land, make sure you hold back some restrictions that benefit your campground. Leases, that's permission to use land and buildings for a term without losing ownership. But during that term, the tenant has possession of the property. Let's say that the Holiday Inn gives a lease to Jen and me to use this part of the room. This is now our property for the purpose of possession. Okay? Now we have obligations to the Holiday Inn. We can't suddenly start tearing it down and things, but it's ours. And if you want to get rid of us, you have to evict us. That is, you have to go to court and ultimately get the sheriff to dispossess us. Licenses, that's like using a hotel or a motel, giving people permission to come onto your property, but they don't have any ongoing rights or any possession. I'm sorry, they don't have any ongoing, we call it estate in the property, okay? And that's exactly what we give to our campers. Mortgages and liens, these are encumbrances. So you want to buy the campground? Great, I'll loan you $2 million, but I'm going to want a mortgage, which means that before you can sell it, you have to get you have to satisfy the mortgage, you have to pay it. Property rights are very important in the United States. They're so important that they're part of the original Constitution, okay? The Bill of Rights is part of the original Constitution, that property cannot be taken for public use without paying just compensation. And that power is, however, of course, like everything in the law, subject to qualification, which is that we have this thing called the police power, which allows you to regulate the way that people behave toward one another and the way they behave toward objects and property and even animals. We have rules that relate to zoning. You can use this parcel for commercial, this parcel for residential, these parcels for agricultural. We have we have regulations on nuisances. You can't run a chicken farm unless you control the odors. You have to keep the noise down, et cetera, et cetera. We have occupational regulations. You can't be a barber unless you've got a license. We have environmental rules. If you're going to store petroleum, you have to store it in solid tanks, and it's got to be on a concrete pad with a spill catcher, on and on and on. One of the things that we have learned and why we have police power regulations is that there's this old adage, one man's ceiling is another man's floor. Without police power regulations, back in Pennsylvania, the coal companies went around and bought up the mineral rights, or they retained the mineral rights, and they started digging coal. Well, unfortunately for the people on the surface, they dug out so much coal that the surface land started subsiding. And they wound up having to adopt laws to say, hey, you can mine, but you got to leave enough coal in place to support the surface so that it doesn't all fall into the ground. Okay? So today what we call property is the right to use land defined by the balance between the private rights you have as landowner and the public rights under the police power. I'm going to tell you that largely because we have police power regulations, we have achieved an incredible level of prosperity. What do I mean by that? Well, how much business would the tourism industry in Wisconsin have if we hadn't developed an interstate system, which makes it possible for people to drive up from Chicago or other points and find it here? And in turn, that interstate system, and indeed our entire highway system, depends on something called the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which is this book that you can, if you really are interested, you can find it online, but it prescribes the style of every sign. That's why all the freeway signs are green and they have the same typeface and the same type size. By the way, if you go to China, they're the same over there too. They're the same everywhere in the world. That manual is followed everywhere in the world. It's really interesting to see freeway signs in Chinese. They're also they're in English too, by the way. Private property is definitely impacted by the infrastructure. Let's face it, the government does deliver some goods that make things better. Okay? If we didn't have fire protection, if we didn't have roads, if we didn't have water supplies or sewer systems or septic regulations or utilities, we couldn't do much with our property. Look what's going on in Venezuela. Bad government, nothing. We need roads. We need a water supply, which is either a public system or, in the case of private wells, wells that meet standards. Septic systems, we have had decades of controversy in Wisconsin over septic regulations. We've now figured out that it's okay to use alternative systems as long as they're safe. They're highly regulated because they should be. We don't want to pollute our own drinking water. I'm going to skip over this because it isn't that big. The point I'm getting is that we have a lot of benefits that we create for ourselves. Police power and zoning also exists to protect the natural infrastructure that gives value to everything that we have. The water we drink fell as rain originally. It may have been hundreds of or thousands of years ago, but it fell as rain. And if we don't take care, we'll use it all up. So we want to make sure that we protect our rivers, our lakes. We want to make sure that we do not encroach upon the rights to others to use navigable waterways. Rivers and lakes are navigable waterways if you can float a canoe in them. We also need to protect our wetlands. I know sometimes people think of those regulations as annoying, but the fact of the matter is that wetlands are a sponge that soak up the water and recharge the groundwater, and we need to protect them. We have to pay attention to the fact that we live in a natural environment where there's a hydrological cycle. And we have to worry about floodplains. And many of you, I'm sure, hear this issue all the time. because of the controversies about it. Shoreland regulations are another area where we have zoning issues. Again, we're trying not to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. Shorelands are valuable. They make our communities more attractive, but we can't overdevelop them. This is an example of a kind of development of a shoreline that is now illegal in Wisconsin. Under current shoreland regulations, if you create a lot, you have to leave at least half of the frontage in wild, undisturbed vegetation to provide for filtering. Frankly, that's good for our lakes, it's good for our state. Skip ahead. So how do we make all this work? We make it work with land use plans, we make it work with zoning. I'm not going to get too far into this except to say that when you get involved in these issues in your community, you need to follow very much what's going on. First of all, you should follow what's going on in the town, period, because it's when you stop watching that things happen, all right? Invariably, and Jen, I'm sure you've had this experience too, the government will be studying something for 2 years. We'll have 25 meetings. And every one of them is in the paper. Every one of them is on the internet. Invariably, the night we're going to adopt it, somebody shows up and says, "Why didn't you tell me that you were going to be regulating my property?" What are we supposed to do? Come over to your property and hit you on the head with a hammer? I mean, you do have some responsibility to monitor this, okay? If you hear that the town or the county is going to be considering updating the comprehensive plan, the land use plan, you better be following it because it is going to affect you, okay? It talks about directions. They can put a map in that land use plan that includes your property that says this property is to be allowed to become wild land again. We're not going to allow any further development of this property. So we've come full circle. The Northwest Ordinance actually was a land use plan of a different kind. It had everything that land use plans needed to have, and it relied on incentives to make and boy did it succeed. I mean, think about it. In 1787, there were essentially no non-native settlers in those 5 states. There were some, but not many. Within 50 years, every square foot of that land had been purchased, every square foot of it had been occupied in one sense or another. By the end of the 20th century, but 19th century, almost all of the old growth lumber in Wisconsin had been cut down. And if you see pictures of what those old growth trees looked like, they were about as big as these tables. They were cut down with human labor and animals. People who are incentivized can get an awful lot done. The world is complex, plans are complex, we need to be part of it. We need to pay attention to what our zoning regulations are. You need to be engaged. I'm going to stop now to allow Jen to make her presentation, but while she transitions, I'll answer a couple questions because she's going to plug her computer in, and then we'll have time at the end to answer questions. I will also be in my booth, which is down the hallway toward the small bar in the tent. Okay, go ahead.
I'm just going to say in general, people, businesses, whatever, tend to look at zoning as a negative. But if you're doing something that is allowed with the zoning on that piece of property, it also protects you. Someone can't come along and say, I don't want you to do that anymore. So if you're doing what you're allowed to do in that zoning district, it also protects you.
Well, zoning is meant to create predictability, and it actually does. If you're zoned properly for commercial use, or whatever the classification is under your zoning ordinance, you get to do what you want. It's when you're not. It's when you want to extend your use into an adjacent parcel that it becomes more complicated, because then you have to comply. But yeah, zoning is not a bad thing per se. You know, the other side of this is campgrounds. Our campgrounds have an impact on adjacent landowners. If you didn't have zoning, every time that you do something that the neighbors don't like, they'd be on you. They'd say, well, you're creating a nuisance. I have a case going on right now that's going to go to trial in April where There are several hundred towns in Wisconsin that do not have zoning at all. The only zoning that exists is county zoning, and there are counties that don't have county zoning, or where the towns have not adopted the county ordinance. So there's a town where there's no zoning at all, and you think, oh, that's paradise. Well, the property, my client bought a piece of property and started a business, happens to generate some noise. Neighbors are suing them, alleging it's a nuisance. If that had been zoned, they would never have dared. So it has its upside. Jen?
All right. So again, my name is Jan Charette. I'm with the Wisconsin Towns Association. And higher? Okay. Thank you. You know what? I'll just talk loudly and then we won't even have to worry about the mic. So I actually served as a clerk thanks Mark, before joining the Wisconsin Towns Association. I actually was a clerk for 4 years with the town of Rockland in Brown County. There we go. And so I got firsthand experience of being able to work with individuals or applicants who came in and applied for a conditional use permit or a rezone. And so I will be sharing that with you. But before I get into that, I just kind of wanted to help you understand a little bit about the makeup of towns and how towns work. So for those of you that don't know, right now we've got about 1,248 towns in the state of Wisconsin. We make up about 28% of the population, about 414 villages and 190 cities, and they then make up the majority of the state population. The land, though, the majority of the land is actually in towns, much like Mark said. So more than likely when you're going and you want to develop something, you're probably going to be asking for permission from the town and possibly the county as well. Towns are actually statutory bodies, which means that they can only do what the legislature has given them the authority to do. So when they're looking at adopting an ordinance or when they're looking to propose to do something, they look at the statutes and they see whether or not the legislature has given them that authority. If they don't have the authority, then they can't do it. There are, though, the statutes have given towns the ability to have village powers. And with village powers, much like Mark was saying earlier, the electors in the town have some say as to whether or not town boards can do certain things. And one of them is the electors can authorize at an annual meeting or at a special town meeting of electors, they can authorize the town board to adopt village powers. Village powers then broadens what a town can do. They can then regulate to protect the public's health, safety, and welfare. So first thing, towns look at the statutes. Do they have the authority to adopt an ordinance? If they don't, the second question they ask is, have our electors given us village powers? If they have village powers, then they can go beyond what the statute says. They can then adopt ordinances. And so some of the other ordinances that you're going to see in your town would be, for example, a subdivision ordinance, or possibly a driveway ordinance, possibly a noise ordinance or a sign ordinance. All of those are ordinances that have been developed under village powers. Zoning, too, is something that the electors can authorize the town board to do. So again, Mark mentioned this annual town meeting. Town meetings are unique in that on the third Tuesday of April, they actually have an annual meeting of the electors. And under 60.10 of the Wisconsin statutes, there are certain things that the electors get to decide, and then there are certain things that the electors actually get to authorize the board to do. And Mark mentioned, electors have the direct ability in towns to set the levy, unless they've delegated that to the town board. They also set the compensation of the elected officials, unless that's been delegated to the town board. They have the ability to combine positions like the clerk and the treasurer. They have the ability to say, hey, instead of nominating by caucus, let's do nomination papers where candidates actually have to go around the town and get signatures, so people nominating them. So those are just some of the direct authority that electors have, and then they have the ability to authorize. And so They authorize the town board to adopt village powers, and the other thing they can do is they can authorize the town board to adopt zoning. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So they are different, much different than cities and villages. They don't have as much authority as a village or city who has a charter ordinance. It's called they have home rule authority, but they can, again, broaden their authority, much like I said. So like Mark said, most of the boards, the town boards that you're going to find, they're three individuals, 3 supervisors. And one of them is the chairperson. And when you look at your ballots, if you live in a town, I live in a town, when we look at our ballots and we go in, you're going to see usually there are two positions, 2 candidates for the supervisors, and then there's an office for chair. They can actually expand the board, increase it to 4 or 5 if they've got village powers, or at a town meeting if they have more than 2,500 in population. Yes?
Why, I'm new to the state and I'm having an issue with this. Why the hierarchy? Is the town protecting themselves and that's why they have this township, the village? Are they protecting themselves, the towns? Why do they have this? It seems like, there's a town within a town, or there's an organization within a town.
The question is why is there hierarchy? So I think, if I'm correct, I think there's around 20, are there 21 states, Mark, or 22 states that have towns? Yes. And then the rest, the remaining states do not have towns. And so for the state of Wisconsin, it was just something that in its history, they decided it was incredibly important for local individuals to be able to protect the interests of their land. And they also wanted the electors, the people who live there, to have an interest and to be able to have a say as to what occurs in that area. And so that's why we have towns. As I said, towns are the only ones in the state of Wisconsin that have that elector input, which is really neat. I mean, you talk about democracy from the ground level. It's really unique. And so if you live in a town and you are an elector, so you're 18, you've resided, a qualified elector is someone who's resided in the town at least 10 days, and a United States citizen. When you go to those elector meetings, either in April, the 3rd Tuesday in April, or if the town or the electors call for a special meeting, you have the ability to vote. If you have, under 60.10 of the Wisconsin stats, if you have the authority to do something as an elector, you can actually vote. So not only do you vote for people who are going to serve on your town board or serve as the treasurer, serve as the clerk, you also have the ability at those meetings to have direct input as to what's occurring in your town. Very unique, very special, and for someone who works for the Towns Association, we're very proud of that fact and protect that. Yeah.
The home rule a little better. The home rule meaning that it starts with the little, or the smallest member, I guess you could say, and that's what's adopted by each entity after that. Like Portage County has to adopt the fact that say this township has made this a rule. Is that how the home rule works? I mean,
no, so, and I won't talk a lot about home rule, because home rule is for cities and villages. And so they adopt a charter ordinance and it allows them to do certain things that, for example, towns can't do. So, for example, a city in their charter ordinance, they could say that the mayor has veto authority over what the council says. So home rule does not apply to towns, okay? And for cities and villages, it's really broad. It's just a adopted charter ordinance which offers broader authority. Yes, ma'am?
Didn't you say, though, that the towns could elect to adopt home rule?
No, I said that the electors can adopt village powers.
Okay.
Village powers.
Which would give them home rule?
No, nope, no, only cities and villages can have home rule. Village powers are basically police powers to regulate the public's health, safety, welfare. Yes, sir?
Single electors could then rescind those powers?
Yes, they are continuing. So the electors at an elector meeting, they are continuing. They could, at a future meeting, rescind that. Yes, they could do that. So the question is whether or not electors can rescind village powers. Yes, they could do that.
I would
highly
Strongly urge
not.
that every town have village powers.
Yeah.
And none ever rescinded it. Even with village powers, towns still don't have an awful lot of authority. They have enough, although I'd like to see them have home rule too, but, you know, you certainly have, you really have nothing to fear from a giant oppressive town. They're not out there.
Yeah. The other thing I want to clarify too, that even though, so, and I know this is a little bit tricky, it's a little bit tricky even for our town board members, but even if the electors at that annual meeting in April or a special town meeting that's called, even if the electors give the board village powers, the board it's called authorizing the board to do something, the board still doesn't have to act on it. So they could have, and I believe it occurred like in the 1960s is when most of the electors were giving their boards village powers. And so whether or not the board decides to adopt some type of licensing ordinance, like a noise ordinance or driveway ordinance, the board may, in that 50-some years, may have done nothing with it. But what it does is it gives them the ability to do it should they find the need in their town. Does that help? Okay. Yes.
Our town actually has 5 supervisors
Okay.
and a chairman, 4 supervisors and a chairman.
Okay.
And can the electors decide to make it a 5-person board?
If they're over, at a town meeting, if they're over 2,500 in population,
Okay.
yes.
And the board can do it on their own. and
If
decide
if they have village powers.
They have that village power.
Right, yep, okay. All right, so the other people who you may work with, so let's just say you're deciding to propose some type of use. The town clerk, like Mark said, has an incredible amount of responsibilities. I actually served as an appointed clerk. An elected clerk, when you're elected in that town, you've got to be an elector. So again, U.S. citizen, 18, resident of the town. I was an appointed clerk. I did not live in the town that I served. I lived in a neighboring town. But they could have an elected or appointed clerk. They could have an elected or appointed treasurer. They can combine, the electors can actually combine those 2 positions into a clerk treasurer. You'll have a town assessor. That person could be elected or appointed. You may have a constable, and you might also have a town administrator that's appointed by the board, and a zoning administrator, a building inspector, so a number of employees or town officials that you may end up working with. Also, like Mark said, most municipalities have adopted a comprehensive land use plan. And when they did that, it was the Plan Commission who was really responsible for putting that all together and making sure that they gave notice to the public, had public participation. Town Plan Commissions, if you're under 2,500 in population, you have 5 members. You do have the option to go up to 7. If you're over 2,500, then you have to have 7 members. These individuals are actually appointed by the town chair, and it's confirmed by the town board. So you're probably going to, if you're doing something related to land use, you're going to be working with the Plan Commission. What do they do? So as Mark kind of mentioned, they develop, they're responsible for developing the land use plan, the comprehensive land use plan. They also, if the board decides to adopt a zoning ordinance, they're heavily involved in putting those terms together. They're going to be involved in subdivision ordinances. A lot of plan commissions will be looking at other ordinances as well. They then will look at amendments. They may suggest amendments to those ordinances based on some of the applications that are coming in or requests that are coming in. They review and then recommend those changes to the town board. They also might have the authority to look at land division applications and also conditional use permits. Now, in some towns, the board has also given the Plan Commission the ability not only to review the application and make a recommendation, because most plan commissions that I know of are advisory in nature. So they advise, they make recommendations to the town board. But there are some plan commissions that actually have been given the authority by the town board to make the final decision. So if you come in and you ask for something like a conditional use permit, that plan commission may actually have the authority to make a final decision on that. But in most cases, you're going to find that they are advisory in nature. And also, though, they're going to look at if you're platting in any way, they're going to be the ones looking at that. All right, there's also a Board of Appeals. So besides a Plan Commission, there's a Board of Appeals. There are two different ways to adopt a zoning ordinance in towns. If you adopt it under 60.62, which is the village powers, that you have 5 members plus 2 alternates. If you decide to create a zoning ordinance under 60.61, which is very, very rare, you have 3 members plus 2 alternates. And again, these individuals are appointed by the town board for 3 years, and they have staggered terms so that you're not losing everyone at the same time. They basically, they also could consider an application for a conditional use permit. So again, just depends on what the ordinance says and what authority it gives them. But in most cases, you're going to go before your Board of Appeals or your Board of Adjustment if you're asking for a variance. You know, there's 2 different types of variances. One is an area variance. An area variance is something when you're asking for like a dimensional, a release or a relaxation from a dimensional requirement. So let's say the ordinance says you've got to have a 25-foot side yard and you're only able to meet a 15-foot side yard, and you're unable to do that. That's where you would go in and you would then ask the Board of Appeals, you would submit an application and ask for a request for a variance. A use variance is when something is not allowed. That use is not allowed in that district. And you're going to the Board of Appeals and you're asking for the use that you're proposing to be allowed. So you've got area and use variances, and that's what the Board of Appeals decides. So zoning is kind of interesting. Yes, ma'am?
I have a question on the use that you just went through.
Yeah.
If something is not defined in the use, does it mean it's actually denied? Because not every situation could possibly be called out in the code
Right.
as approved.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is, I think the question is if the ordinance does not spell out whether or not the use is allowed in the district, right? In the zoning district. And then your question is
Then they're telling you can't do it.
is it prohibited? And I'm actually going to get into that in another couple slides. Okay, so zoning is a little interesting. Counties, just know that counties can adopt zoning ordinances. They're called general zoning ordinances. Counties have to adopt ordinances. By statute, they're required to adopt ordinances in the floodplain and then in the shoreline areas. And those ordinances apply in the towns regardless of whether or not the town has adopted an ordinance. And the Attorney General actually just came down with a recent opinion saying that those county shoreline ordinances apply in the towns regardless of whether or not the town has a zoning ordinance in those areas. And so when we're talking about shorelands, we're talking about 1,000 feet of the ordinary high water mark of a lake, pond, or flowage, and then 300 feet of an ordinary high water mark of a river or stream. So if your land is located within that area of a lake, pond, or flowage, or river or stream, it's going to be the county ordinance, the shoreline ordinance that applies in those areas. So towns may adopt general county zoning, and a county also has the authority to adopt general zoning. So how does that work, right? If you've got 2 different entities that can adopt zoning in the same area, well, if the county has adopted a general county zoning ordinance, the town's got a couple of different options. They can elect to have no general county zoning apply in the town. So in other words, when the county adopts their zoning ordinance, it goes to the town, and the town has the ability to say, yes, we want it to apply in our town, or no, we don't want it to apply in our town. The other thing they can do is they can say, yes, we would like the county zoning ordinance to apply in our town. And it's interesting enough that once they do that, they cannot get out of what we call county zoning unless there is a comprehensive revision to the county zoning ordinance. So once towns make that decision, they are under county zoning, or unless you've got an attorney like Mark who's able to get most of Dane County out of it. Correct, Mark?
Yeah, well, we got a law passed that gave towns the option to withdraw.
Right. But that's,
6 of them have withdrawn,
yes, 6 out of how many towns?
34.
6 out of 34 towns.
Once we got the legislation passed, then the county started intimidating the towns, so that's another.
Yeah. But it does require a comprehensive revision of the county zoning ordinance for the town to opt out. The other thing is the town could just adopt its own zoning ordinance. If the county has not adopted its general zoning ordinance, the town, again, can elect to have no general zoning. They can elect, again, to adopt its own zoning ordinance where, because there's no county zoning ordinance, they don't need the county board approval. Remember, if they have village powers, then the electors have said, hey, we're okay with you guys adopting a zoning ordinance, and now the county doesn't have one. It's perfectly fine for the town to just adopt its own zoning ordinance. Yes, sir?
Does there have to be shoreland zoning?
There has to be shoreland.
If you don't have county, the town has to adopt it.
No, the county may not adopt a comprehensive zoning ordinance, but they still have to have a shoreline ordinance and they have to have a floodplain. They can't get out of that. So they have to at least have those 2 ordinances. The other one is, again, this is very rare, but 60.61 allows the town to be able to adopt a zoning ordinance. In this case, when it's 60.61 versus the 60.62 village powers, they actually have to petition the county to adopt a zoning ordinance. And the county has about a year to adopt a zoning ordinance or not adopt. And if the county chooses not to adopt a zoning ordinance, then the town can go ahead and adopt their own. So most of our towns are just going to go and ask their electors for village powers, ask for the authority for zoning, and then go that route because it's a lot easier to do. So I wanted just to show you a map. It's from 2010, but this is actually the Department of Administration. Oh, it doesn't show, Mark. Why is that? Give me just, okay. So in 2010, the Department of Administration, I believe, had some money, and they were able to gather some statistics on how many towns have their zoning, how many counties have zoning, and I'm trying to bring that map up. So right now, as of 2010, 242 towns had their own zoning ordinance. 767, so remember we've got 1,250 towns, 767 had adopted the county zoning ordinance, and then 246 towns had no zoning other than that shoreline and floodplain. So if we can bring that map up, there actually are, when you look at this map, there are actually areas of the state where there's no county zoning and no town zoning. Okay, so you always want to check that. Okay, Mark, actually we can just go back to the PowerPoint, but I did put in my slide where you can find the link to look at that map. It is from 2010. Thanks, Mark. Okay. Just need to resume. That's okay, no big deal. Okay, so why do towns zone? Why do counties zone? Again, like Mark said, it's a great way to be able to protect the public's health, safety, and welfare. And so you want to be able to, again, protect your natural resources. You want to make sure that there's consistency, protect the investments. How much do we as a town or a county have to put into our roads and our infrastructure? And so it really creates order and consistency. And so I believe zoning actually started in the 1920s, really was to protect residential properties. And the reason why they wanted to do that is because you wanted to make sure you didn't have industry, mills, and other type of development moving into residential areas. So that's actually how zoning started way back in the 20s. And that's really what you're trying to do, is create order, create consistency, protect values. And so when you are, here's the question you had, ma'am. when you're thinking about developing something or creating something, you want to ask, is what I propose, is it allowed? And so there are really 3 different uses. One is a permitted use. The permitted use is actually, it's going to be listed in the district and it's allowed. So it's allowed by right, but you still have to meet the requirements of the ordinance. So for example, the land that I own, we own a home. And so if I were to go and look at the map in the town that I live in, the area that I live in is going to be zoned residential. And then that's called the map, the zoning map. Then I would go to the text in relation to the residential district, and I would read the text of the zoning ordinance, and I would find out what can I do. So in the residential district that my parcel is on, what am I able to do? And so I, more than likely in a residential district, have the right to build a single family home. But the question is then can I build a big accessory building, like a 5,000 square foot accessory building on my residential 1 acre lot? Probably not, because it's going to be bigger than probably my house. Or can I build 2 single family homes? More than likely not. And so when you're looking at zoning, you're looking at a zoning map, which tells you what district your parcel is in, and then you're also looking at the zoning text, which tells you what's allowed in that district. So permitted use is a use that is allowed in that zoning district. A conditional use is a use that's allowed, but with conditions and with approval by whatever body has been given the authority to grant or deny that application. So for example, could be the town board, or as I said earlier, it could be your Board of Appeals, it could be your Plan Commission. And here's the question you had, ma'am. If it's an unlisted, or it specifically says a prohibited use, it's a use that is expressly prohibited or not allowed in the district. And so when you go to the text, so you find your parcel, what you do is you find your parcel and you look at the map, find out what your parcel is zoned, then go to the text, look at the text, and say, is it a permitted use? Is it a conditional use? Or is it just not allowed, period? Does everyone understand that? Okay. So that's really what you're going to do. And you weren't able to bring up that the map. Okay, because I was going to show you in the townofrockland.org, which is where I worked. You can actually go, and on the left-hand side, it's got a map. You can click on the map. You can actually go, so landowners in the town of Rockland can go and look at that zoning map, and they can find out what their land is zoned. And then they can click on ordinance, and then they can go in the search button, put in zoning. They can then look at the text in that district, and they can find out what's allowed. So about half, well, not even half, about 500 towns have websites. And we're trying to get more and more to have websites. So that they're one of them where you can go on the website and find it. Otherwise, you really probably just need to make a phone call to the town clerk, find out if they have a zoning administrator, make a phone call to the zoning administrator, and find out what your property is currently zoned, whether or not they have an ordinance that you can either go in and look at, or whether or not they might be able to email or send it to you. So this is what you're going to do. When you're asking it, you're going to look to see what it's zoned. You're then going to look at the ordinance to see if it's allowed, and then discuss with them. Discuss with the town or discuss with the county. Because remember, not all towns have town zoning, right? They have county. And so you're going to check to see whether or not, whether what you're proposing is actually allowed. The other thing is if it's not allowed in the district, the question that you can ask is, could I possibly be able to amend the zoning, like ask for a rezoning, or they call it an amendment to the zoning ordinance? Could I go in and ask for my property to be rezoned? And so that certainly is an option too. One of the things though that they do look at whatever, if it's the plan commission or the town governing board, they're going to be looking at your comprehensive land use plan. They're going to check to see whether or not what you're proposing, the proposed use, actually is in line with the comprehensive land use plan. So again, let's say you decide and you've talked to the staff and you'd like to have your property rezoned so that you can put whatever you're proposing and you can do whatever you're proposing on your land. There are application materials you would get from the staff. Again, you could get from the clerk, town clerk, or county clerk. You would then complete those. Again, you want to go to the text of the ordinance because it lays out the procedure, and it also tells you what you need to attach as supporting documentation. There are usually the standards as to what needs to be shown. And so again, you're developing, let's say, evidence. You're putting together a packet of evidence to basically support and show to the board why you should get this rezoning approved. Then they have to have a public hearing. The public hearing is preceded by a Class 2 notice. So that means that there's a notice that's more than likely published, although in towns it could be posted in 3 public places or posted on the town's website and 1 public place. But in most cases, you're going to see it in the newspaper, and it's going to be 2 times, at least 2 weeks. The first one will be at least 2 weeks before the public hearing. The second one will be at least 1 week before the public hearing. And that notice says, Mark Hazelbaker has applied to have parcel number, whatever, rezoned from farm or agricultural to business 2, you know, and the time of the hearing, the location, and all of that. That then is sent to the applicant. That's also sent to potentially neighboring properties around that parcel that possibly could get rezoned. Yes, sir, you have a question.
I was just going to ask about notifying the neighbors. Is that a requirement that everyone within 500 feet, or is that just what most towns do?
I think it's usually in the ordinance, but there is the ability for the neighbors to actually submit what are called protest petitions. And there's in the statute, it talks about a certain percentage, it's 20%, and I think it's with either of neighboring or within 100 feet, I'd have to look it up. Is it 300 feet? 300 feet of that parcel to be rezoned. And so most of the time it's the ordinance which will say, yes, we're going to notify the neighbors, but usually in the statutes, it does not actually require it. It just requires that Class 2 notice. So again, you'd have to look at the statute, see what the statute says, and then make a determination. For example, if you're near like a base, a military base, that has at least 200 personnel, you have to notify them. So it just depends on the situations of what, you know, where your town's located. Yeah.
You just mentioned that there's an obligation to inform the property owner that their issue is coming up, or maybe a circumstance might be adopted related to their property. What happens if the property owner never received notification that something was going to happen to them at the next board meeting?
Well, actually, what I referred to is the actual applicant. So what's going to happen is when that public hearing is set, the notice is going to be sent to the applicant. And then the property owners, if there's an ordinance that says that, yes, we're going to notify all the neighboring property owners within 100 feet, then notice has to go out to them as well. But the other thing is property owners, all of you, if you live in a town, you can actually submit a request to the clerk and say, I would like to be informed whenever there are going to be any requests for rezonings, or whenever they're going to be, you could even ask just to have the agenda emailed to you every time the town board meets. So you have the opportunity to do that. But they do have to meet that Class 2 publication. If they don't do that, then they're going to have to go back and redo it.
So I know a circumstance where an ordinance was being changed, it's going to affect one property owner?
Right, so
And then there's a requirement then to notify you that we're going to be changing or adopting this, and it's going to affect you, give you a chance to come to a hearing and know about it? Or do they get to do that without notifying the property owner?
well, again, the question, I would always look at the ordinance, okay? And then the ordinance has got to be in conformity with the state statute. So whatever the ordinance says is going to be in conformity with the state statute. But then some town boards choose to add on to what the state statute says. So at a minimum, you've got to have a Class 2 notice. Whether or not the town board has added language to put in protections for the landowner, then you would just look at the ordinance. But at a minimum, you've got to have that Class 2 notice. So as a member of the public, if you come in, it's much like Mark said, you know, if you come in and you say, well, I didn't receive notice, well, was it in, you know, they're going to go to the clerk and they're going to ask the clerk, was it published? And the newspaper sends an affidavit to the clerk that says it was published on this date and this date. So it isn't as if you could say, well, I didn't know, it's just that it was in the newspaper and nobody read about it. So, yeah. But that's what I'm saying, you can go to the clerk and say, I would like to be put on this list, could you please notify me? And then the clerk will be obligated to send that to you.
They are obligated.
If you ask for it, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
So the original question here would be unlisted use, because you got a room full of very creative people, right? So
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you.
the unlisted use, is that just lumped into the not permitted?
Right, so, correct. So the question is whether or not, if you've got an unlisted use. So yes, if there's not a use listed as either permitted or as a conditional use, it's not allowed.
So instead of rezoning, can that go to conditional use?
Again, you'd have to look at the ordinance and see whether or not that would be allowed. The other option is, and this does happen. So the town board, for example, we had a situation in Rockland where someone wanted to do something which was more like agribusiness, okay, but it wasn't allowed in the agricultural district. And so what the board did is basically said to the applicant, hold on, let us take a look at this. Went to the Plan Commission, and they ended up amending the map and the text to include a agribusiness. And then what that allowed is it allowed this business that wanted to come in, basically put in a business in the agricultural area to have an agribusiness. So towns can, and they should, because times change. They have the ability to take a look at their ordinance at any time and amend it. And if they see that there's a need or an opportunity, again, that's probably what's going to happen is they're going to defer it back to the Plan Commission. They are then going to have the Plan Commission make recommendations, and then the governing board, the town board, is going to decide whether or not to amend the ordinance. So that's a possibility. Yes, sir.
So you want to change the zoning, township sends a note to anybody that's going to be impacted, it's not like we're 3 feet of you. Neighbor comes in and says, I don't want you to do that. So, I mean, I'm applying for something, and some neighbor could come in and say, I don't want him to do that, but ultimately it's up to the board to decide, you know, it doesn't really, we take everything into consideration, but we're still going to do it, or we're not going to do it. That's how it works?
That's correct. And actually, the law was changed last year to really just, for example, on conditional use permits, it was codified to say, look, the case law had always said the board should be relying on substantial evidence, which is more than just mere hearsay. And so that's always been the case if you look at the Wisconsin court cases. But last year, the legislature actually codified that. They put it in the statute that talks about conditional uses. And they've said, you know, whenever any of you, the county, city, village, or town, consider conditional use, you've got to look at substantial evidence. And you, the applicant, it's on you to show that you can, if it's a conditional use permit, you can meet the conditions that are set forth in that ordinance. Do you have anything else to add?
If I may,
Yeah.
I think your question brings up an important point which cannot be understated. The ordinance will say all kinds of criteria are enumerated as considerations in adopting a conditional use permit or changing zoning.
Right.
The reality is that in every town I've ever seen, in every land use decision I've ever seen, the number one criteria is what do the adjoining property owners think, okay? And if you don't have a long-standing relationship with your neighbors, don't be surprised when they jump on you. They may anyway, but certainly if they don't know you and they haven't heard from you and you haven't communicated with them, you're going to get the reaction that you would probably deserve. It's really important to reach out to your neighbors. They have an awful lot of power and influence. If if you're ever gonna need anything, or ever gonna be, if you ever are concerned about what they might do to you, you can't take them for granted. You just can't.
Good point. Yes, yes.
What if you got 5 neighbors, but just one that opposes, that's just enough?
Well, not always, you know, and again, if you can go to the town board and you can say, you know, we have been good neighbors, we've given our phone numbers out to them for years, always answered any questions or problems. We've invited our neighbors to come and have to an open house, come and visit us, see what we're up to. Town boards are smart. They know that there are troublesome people. They deal with them too. So you just have to work with your neighbors, and if you've got one that's troubled, you may have to isolate.
Yeah, yes,
And is it not true though that, I think it was at 67, was it last year?
Correct.
The year before, that made it supposedly a lot easier to get conditional use approved, especially if you have a campground ordinance in place. Essentially, they can't pile on extra conditions on the conditional use above and beyond what the ordinance already says, because that's really your conditional use.
It certainly provided more guidance to the town boards, the city councils, and village boards. Never say never. You know, of course, the ultimate point, whenever you adopt legislation like that, is the court going to be willing, relying on this new statute to overrule a village board, a town board, or a common council? That is so difficult. I don't care what statutory changes that can be. Courts just don't like making land use decisions, and even though those changes are there, you know, the only way to enforce it is to go to court. They don't expect the courts to say anything.
right. So just to address that, so the question was regarding 2017 Wisconsin Act 67, and that is true. Is Wisconsin Act 67 is basically we recommend to our towns that in their ordinances that whatever conditions you're going to require in there, so that you're not pulling them from wherever, so that the ordinance would actually state the conditions. The other thing that it did, Wisconsin Act 67, basically if you can show as an applicant that you can meet those conditions in that conditional use permit, they have to grant you the conditional use permit. So that's the one other change that actually occurred based on Act 67. So just one other last point is, you know, the public hearing. So that is the opportunity for you as the applicant. When you go to the public hearing, they're going to ask you, okay, what are you proposing, and what information do you have to substantiate what you're asking for, either a rezoning or that on that conditional use permit. That's your opportunity. You go first. Then they're going to ask probably any of the staff, the zoning administrator, the plan commission, what did they recommend? And then other individuals of the public are allowed to speak. But again, it is based upon case law and now based upon the statute that was amended. The town board's decision or the county board, whoever's making that decision on that application, they are supposed to consider the substantial evidence. So that's not just people's opinions or hearsay. That's obviously allowed. But it is supposed to be based on facts and information, and that's always been the case. It's not on made up, information. It's based on facts. It's based on information, maybe based on, for example, we had a situation, somebody wanted to put a haunted house in an area, and the neighbors came in and said, look, these 3 nights out of the year, we are going to have increased traffic. You're expecting thousands of people to come on, the haunted house is saying we're going to have thousands of people coming in between the hours of 7 p.m. and 11 p.m. And the neighbors came in, and what did they provide? There's going to be additional traffic on a 2-lane road. And how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to deal with the traffic and the extra people? Those were legitimate concerns that were substantiated based upon the information that the applicant provided. And so, again, it's not, I don't feel that this shouldn't occur. It's based on facts and information, substantial evidence.
It will make a difference, but I'm going to say, based on having litigated these cases for more than 30 years, that it may succeed in changing the odds from 1 in 1,000 to more like 10 in 100. So, you know, the key, the bottom line is, this is a political process, and that's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. But if you're not engaged in what drives politics, which overwhelmingly is public opinion and the interests of principally the neighbors, then you're at the mercy of the process. You want to know, I'm going to end with what I said. You got to be acquainted with your town board and your town clerk. You've got to be engaged in the politics of your communities, because whether you like it or not, the old saying is true, either you're at the table or you're on it, okay? And you want to get to know your neighbors because they have an enormous amount of influence over your future. It's the right thing to do, okay? I'm going to be around all day and tomorrow over at our tent. Nancy and I will be holding court there. You can stay around for a few minutes, I'm sure. So we're going to end the session. We're out of time, but we will be available to answer questions.